From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I said to one of the nurses that I was still in quite a lot of pain, and so she said, I'll get the doctor.
That's a man we're calling John. We've altered his voice to protect his identity.
That was when I met Dr. Stan. He kind of came through and said that he was going to be the one to give me the medication.
John arrived in hospital after a fall, bleeding and in pain. He thought the worst was behind him.
You know, he's a doctor in a hospital. You're supposed to kind of trust what they say.
I should warn you, this episode will contain difficult details of sexual abuse. As it turned out, John was one of hundreds of victims. But even after that doctor was struck off, he still managed to find a way to carry on treating patients.
The fact that someone who has negatively impacted so many lives has then been allowed to keep practicing is abhorrent. It makes it feel like the people in charge think nothing of the people that have already been his victims.
And that doctor isn't a one-off. A devastating new investigation by The Times found more than 20 doctors working in the NHS who'd been struck off in other countries, either for abusing their position or for sheer incompetence. And yet, they were still managing to practice here, sometimes with devastating consequences.
If he'd have kept her in, if my mum hadn't have been discharged, she would have still been alive today. He gave my mum her death sentence. I feel very angry.
The story today. Why is the NHS employing banned doctors?
This is an investigation that affects every one of us.
George Greenwood is investigations reporter at The Times.
Because it's about your doctor and whether you can trust them to look after you. And as we've established in this investigation, that's not necessarily something you can rely on.
George, just tell us what you've been investigating.
So we've been looking at whether the information about your doctor on what's known as the General Medical Council's register is accurate, and in particular, whether misconduct by doctors overseas is missing from the register. Now, patients, if they have any concerns about their doctor or want to do a bit more checking on their doctor's competence, can go onto the GMC website and look up whether there are any practice concerns about their doctor. The problem is, this register is far from perfect. We've identified 22 cases where malpractice or restrictions on doctors that have been made in countries as far from Ireland to the USA to Scandinavia are missing. So there's no indication that the doctor you've been treated by in these cases had quite serious malpractice findings against them in some of these cases.
And just give us a sense, we're going to go into the detail of this, but just give us a sense of the scope of your investigation. How big a problem is this?
We've been looking at two categories of malpractice, really. This is what's come out from our investigation. Some of this is sexual malpractice. So it's doctors having inappropriate sex with patients or sexually harassing colleagues in their practices, and clinical incompetence. So cases where doctors have not been meeting training standards or are acting unsafely, and where this is the potential to harm patients in a clinical sense.
And how many have you found?
So in total, we found 22 cases of doctors who had active UK licences where there was no record of malpractice in a foreign jurisdiction on their GMC records. There are also a number of cases we identified where doctors were able to practice in the UK despite a foreign practice limitation, but had got their jobs in the NHS before the GMC eventually discovered them. So they were treating patients at the time where they really shouldn't have been.
So you could be banned in one country, come here, be working in the NHS without anybody knowing.
You are required to tell the GMC about overseas rulings, but what our investigation shows is a very large number of doctors are simply lying. Now, not in all cases. In some of these cases, doctors will have told the GMC about these notices and be cleared for practice. But even then, there are cases where, even if they are permitted by the GMC to practice in the UK, the public would probably want to know about the misconduct that had been identified in their pasts. So not all doctors are lying, but certainly in some of the most severe cases where they've had their licenses revoked, we found that they simply lied to the GMC and did not tell them. And it appears there are limited ways in which the GMC are able to detect that.
I mean, that really is extraordinary, and I think it'll alarm most of us. You know, we all come into contact with the NHS. We all rely on doctors being absolutely trustworthy. Just tell us, how did you begin investigating this? How did you get onto this story?
So last year, I did an investigation into use by British criminals of Dubai property to avoid police investigations into illicitly obtained wealth. And
I should say we did a podcast on it. Do go back and listen now.
Do go back and listen to that one. This was with a group called the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It's a group of journalists who bring reporters from around the world together to take on really big topics. And I attended their conference in Riga in Latvia last August. And as part of that, we had a brainstorming session where we were discussing, well, what should we do next? And our Norwegian partner raised an idea of stories that he'd been writing about doctors who'd been banned in Norway, simply moving jurisdiction and going to work in Germany, despite having really serious sexual malpractice findings against them. But he said his frustration was he didn't have the resources to look at it from a European-wide prospect. And he said that OCCRP and its partners were the people who really should be taking this on as the next topic. So from there, we started gathering information. And from an initial start of a few outlets, it built up. And I think we're looking at 40-some outlets who've published stories on doctors in their jurisdictions.
So these are 40 newspapers, TV channels across the world, really, who are contributing to this.
Yeah, this is the Panama Papers of doctors. The key weakness in the international system is information sharing. It's not always the case that if a doctor is banned in one country, that doctor's regulator will provide information or even just enough information for another regulator to make a decision on that. So what we did for this project was gather as much data as possible. So we had to use a computer program. We gathered as many countries' ban list of doctors and as many countries' licensing lists of doctors to build a database of different countries, mainly Scandinavia, the US, Canada, a few smaller European countries, where we could then match the two together and identify cases where doctors in one jurisdiction matched the name of a doctor in another jurisdiction who had a restriction or a ban. And then we did good old-fashioned shield journalism, door-knocking those doctors or getting in contact with their representatives to establish what they had to say about the malpractice abroad, whether they had any extenuating circumstances, or whether they wanted to comment on why they had either not told the GMC or whether they think the GMC should be disclosing the information about them.
So this is a long, detailed, painstaking investigation to find the 22 people you've talked about. Out of those cases, just talk us through some of the stories that really stayed with you. Talk us through some of those doctors.
I think the one that sticks to me most is a guy called Sujan Thyagarajan. Dr. Thyagarajan met a patient in his office, and the New Mexico board documents show that they had sex and that this was at the same appointment. It prescribed her a very powerful opiate, oxycodone. A complaint was made by his patient very shortly after the appointment. Not to be too graphic, but evidence that they had sex was found in a copy of a magazine in his office. He then proceeded to flee the country before a DNA match could be made.
And so with that incident, is the implication that he was demanding sex for a prescription for opioids?
So we can't tell, based on the findings of the New Mexico board, what they did find was that he'd had inappropriate sex with a patient on the balance of probabilities. As a result of the findings, they struck him off from the New Mexico register. Now, what struck me about this case was that he attempted to get his license back several times in different jurisdictions, from Montana to Guam, which is a tiny island, it's US territory. And they spotted his New Mexico records, which were on the first page of Google. So if you Google his name, about 5 or 6 pars down, you see a link to a New Mexico board document which says he has had his license restricted. Now, he failed in all these US states, but despite this, the GMC granted him a license.
They seem to be doing less checking than the island of Guam.
Exactly.
And do you know where he's been operating and what sort of patients he's been seeing?
So he works for an NHS mental health trust. He's a psychiatrist by training. And in Bradford, that trust gave him a job.
And have you spoken to that trust? Are they able to explain why they did that?
So the trust has been fairly robust in their response. We've asked them repeatedly whether they only discovered that he was banned in the US after our approaches. They said that to suggest that they had only found out when we went to them would be libelous of the trust. They also suggested that it would be inaccurate. We repeatedly asked them, could you tell us what date on which you discovered this and how you discovered it? And they've refused to say. I've never had an NHS trust be so aggressive about dealing with a individual detail where the journalist is just trying to get the facts right.
That's remarkable. So they're saying it's libelous to imply that they didn't know about it until you went to them with the facts.
That's correct. It's really unclear why they won't simply either say, yes, we discovered on Google this in LX date and we initiated an investigation, or to tell us, yes, the Times notified of this and we investigated.
And what's happened to him now?
He's now under investigation by the trust and has been suspended, so he can no longer treat British patients. So there is no chance of any further risk from him. And he will now likely face a GMC hearing, but that will likely take a matter of months before any ruling occurs. But it's likely he will be banned from practicing without the GMC's permission. I called Dr. Thiagaraj and asked him if he wanted to give any comments, but he said he didn't because of the ongoing NHS investigation. Another case that shocked me is that of a man called Sattar Kadem. He has had his licenses revoked in 2 European countries. He's a radiologist, so it means he looks at patient scans and assesses what's going wrong in them to allow for a proper treatment plan to be provided. Now, he'd also practiced in Sweden previously, and in 2021, an investigation by the Swedish medical regulator found that his practice wasn't up to scratch. They'd identified cases where he'd missed really important issues on scans like bone damage, blood clots, matters like this where there could be patient harm if these issues were missed or not identified in time. And luckily that the risk had been avoided because his colleagues had spotted the missing issues in peer review.
Because mistakes like that could cost lives.
Definitely. They put him on a 3-year probation program to get him up to standards and required him to do more training. He didn't engage with this training program, and in 2023, he was struck from the Swedish Register. In Scandinavia, there's quite a good information sharing process, so he also had a license in Norway, but then the Swedes told the Norwegians what happened, and he lost his license in Norway as well. Now, throughout this process, he was licensed in the UK, and the GMC does not seem to have spotted these 2 bans. Eventually, I paid him a visit at his house in northwest London and asked him whether he had anything to comment about this. He declined to comment.
And who were his employers?
So his employers were an NHS contractor called Hexarad. This is a remote radiology company that provides services to the NHS, remote scans where it hires radiologists to review patient scans on behalf of the NHS.
Wow, so this will be feeding into NHS consultants.
It's quite possible he was treating NHS patients, yes.
And what's happened to him now?
So he's been fired by Hexarad on the basis of what the information at the time provided, and they say they've referred him to the GMC. The GMC will now likely conduct an investigation into him, but generally in these cases, obviously we can't speak for this case, but generally you would be struck off for not telling the GMC about an overseas ban.
George, so far we've got 2 cases. One showing somebody being sexually inappropriate with patients, being struck off and somehow still managing to end up here working within the NHS, and another who just seems to be incompetent, who isn't quite up to the job, who is able to make life and death decisions that could shape somebody's future. They literally could result in the most catastrophic consequences. And he's been working here too, completely free to do so.
Exactly. And there are cases where not picking up that a doctor has been suspended overseas can contribute to a patient's death.
George, you said a moment ago that there was even a case where the worst did happen. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we do, though, tell me about one of the other victims you spoke to.
Sure. So far, we've been talking about doctors who've been banned abroad and have come here to work. Now we have a case where a doctor has been struck off in the UK for seriously abusing patients at an NHS hospital, but because of failures in the international system, is now free to practice in another European country.
So basically the inverse of what we've been hearing.
Yes, exactly. So one of the victims we spoke to, we'll call him John because we've anonymised him to ensure he was able to talk to us, gets pushed over in just as part of a night out. He has a very nastily lacerated finger and some other injuries as well.
I sliced my hand open, my finger. I could see the muscle in my finger because it cut so deep on the barbed wire. And as I kind of fell down, my shoulder popped out as well. So that was dislocated as well. And then my dad had to call an ambulance, and then, I ended up at Royal Cornwall Hospital.
So he's in some discomfort.
I sort of said to one of the nurses that I was still in quite a lot of pain. And so she said, I'll get the doctor. And then that was when I met Dr. Stern. He kind of came through and said that he was going to be the one to give me the medication.
But there's a catch. He has to give him this medicine rectally.
And he asked if I'd ever had a suppository, to which I said no, I hadn't. If I'd ever taken any medication rectally, I said no. And he said, well, I'll go and get it now. It'll help you kind of get rid of some of the pain.
Is that normal?
That's completely abnormal. It's a very rare thing to do in the UK unless it's seen as clinically necessary.
I was a bit reluctant, and so I asked him, are there any other ways I could take it? And he said, I remember him saying exactly like, no, I have to do it this way. There are no other alternatives.
And at this stage, John was not asked for his consent, verbally or written.
He kind of walked in and introduced himself, and then went into talking about the medication. And then he, said, I'll be right back. Went to get the medication and some gloves. And when he came back, he had me lie. He said, like you've seen people on TV giving birth. I had my legs up so that my knees were up, I guess. And he was stood to the right of me, and I remember him just sort of standing over me and telling me to relax. He administered the medication and then was stood there for a while over me. And I remember sort of looking up at him as if to say, what's taking so long? And he just kind of said, I just need to make sure it's gone in. It sort of left me feeling wrong in more than one way.
It later emerges that around 200 patients had been subject to a similar experience with this doctor. And eventually the GMC investigate and found that it was sexually motivated.
I think people always think that if something like that happens, that they will act differently. And I was probably one of those people, but when it did happen, I did freeze and I didn't know what to do. And I think that one of the hardest things was I was blaming myself for it a lot.
George, did you approach Dr. Stan for comment?
So I didn't speak to him personally, but our Romanian reporting partners did. And to them he said, everything I did in the patient's interest. None of his patients had complained, and on the contrary, they were satisfied and I congratulated him on the care he provided. Eventually, Dr. Stan was fired by the NHS Trust and struck off from the GMC register, which bans him from ever working in the UK again. And the NHS Trust has now accepted liability for these incidents. But they didn't stop him practicing. He returned home to Romania, and despite local media reporting on the case and the GMC having told the Romanian regulator about this, he's still working as a doctor.
That's just shocking.
Yeah. We actually went to the Romanian medical regulator about this, and they said they had no power to remove his licence, given there'd been no findings against him in Romania. Hopefully, after our reporting, both in the UK and through our Romanian reporting partner, that there might be a change. But it just seems shocking that somebody who a credible, quasi-legal investigative body has found serious sexual misconduct, any regulator would look at that and think it will probably be fine.
It's so alarming to think that doctor is still seeing patients now. And George, you hinted earlier that sometimes the consequences in cases like this, where doctors who've been suspended or banned in certain countries are able to carry on somewhere else, the consequences can be deadly. Tell us about some of the other people you've met.
Sure. 67-year-old Denise Barnes had a few health issues, but she was a bubbly grandmother who loved spending time with her grandkids.
She was very outgoing, always a laugh. At parties, mum and dad were always dancing and jiving. She was very, very family orientated.
She started to have some breathing difficulties, and her family encouraged her to get to hospital and went with her to a hospital in Nottingham to try and help her.
So on the Friday, mum was like, she was struggling to catch her breath. And, you know, I said to Dad, look, you know, we need to ring an ambulance. I mean, we was actually in A&E for about 8.5 hours. So obviously they're coming around, they're doing the checks. So then obviously they put mum on oxygen, and then mum's oxygen levels went back up to basically normal rate.
And she started to get a bit better. But then, through no fault of her own, she saw the wrong doctor.
So then Dr. Potten came, and what he did say was it was not life-threatening, it wasn't cancerous, and to be quite honest, Mrs. Barnes, it wasn't an A&E and an emergency. So he was going to send her home. And I did turn around to him and say, are you joking? Because mum can't breathe. And what he did say was, is she's breathing now. But unbeknown, we knew that A&E had an airway bed in place. They had a ward for her to go on to. But he discharged her. And as soon as me and my sister got mum to the car with Dad, she was struggling to breathe in the car. So I wound the window down a bit and I said, look, mum, we need to go back. And she said, no, I'm not going back. They've said there's nothing wrong. I'm going home. And then that night she passed away.
This is a woman who's on oxygen, who can't breathe.
Yeah.
He sends her home.
He sends her home, and she dies later that night.
That's horrifying.
Dr. Ajit Pothan had no place anywhere near the NHS, but he'd failed to disclose to either the Trust or the GMC that he'd had his right to practice in a Dutch hospital restricted after an investigation into concerns over medical malpractice. So he was a ENT doctor, ear, nose and throat, and there'd been 4 cases where his surgical interventions were found to be below standards, basically. So he was suspended by his hospital, not by the health regulator in the Netherlands, but he lied about the hospital ban to the GMC and to the hospital trust, who then gave him the job. And then he got banned in the UK off the back of that, and then got banned fully in the Netherlands off the back of the UK ban.
If he'd have kept her in, like everything was prepared for her, she would have still been alive. He gave my mum her death sentence. My mum was taken from us and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren.
I think that they are very angry with the system. It was only after they themselves dug up online information about this guy's practice in the Netherlands that the GMC investigated.
I mean, somebody lost their lives because of his complete misjudgment as a doctor. Tell me he isn't still working.
He is. Dr. Pothen is still practicing in Germany, despite having had his license restricted and revoked in 2 different countries. So his Dutch license has now also been fully revoked. But our German partners' investigations were able to book appointments with him in Germany without any trouble.
That's extraordinary and terrifying.
Dr. Pothen's lawyers said that his Dutch and his UK revocations had no effect on his German medical licence, and they say the German authorities had been informed of this. He also extended his sympathies to the family of Denise Barnes.
How has this been allowed to happen? I mean, where are things going wrong?
So one trick that doctors are using is something called jurisdiction shopping. So if a doctor has a serious malpractice complaint in a country, but say, for example, they trained elsewhere, what they might try and do is go back to their home country, try and work there, get some work time there that they can write about to another jurisdiction and make sure their license is in good standing in their country of education, and then use that license to work abroad again. Because that way, the regulator that's employing them won't necessarily be aware that in another jurisdiction they'd had a practice finding against them. Their home country license will be completely clean, and there's nothing that would tip off the new regulator about their previous malpractice.
Why aren't the countries and the administrations and the regulatory bodies talking to each other?
It was the most shocking thing about this investigation for me, is it just seems so obvious that there needs to be a system. And there was one that was better than what we have now before Brexit. We used to be part of something called IMI, and that, while far from perfect, did exchange information between British and European regulators when something went wrong. And after Brexit, we lost access to that. We have continued to notify individual bodies, but we don't get the same sort of consistent information in the same form as we did before.
And what did the GMC say when you went to them, when you pointed out these 22 cases that they should really have picked up themselves?
So they are looking at these cases carefully and will look at whether further regulatory action will now be needed. But they said that patient care is one of the most important things they do. We did put specific questions about them, about how this had come to happen, but they directed us to the more generic comment they provided.
George, while investigating this story, you've clearly approached many of the authorities, including the Department for Health. How have they responded?
So what was very interesting in this case is we had a very strong reaction from the Department of Health before we'd even gone to press. Wes Streeting, the Health and Social Care Secretary, called our findings horrific and said they represented a serious failure in our medical regulatory systems. He also said that he'd taken immediate action, requesting urgent clarification from the GMC about their vetting processes for international doctors.
So they're clearly taking it very seriously. And George, just finally, for you, as someone who's spent months looking into this, you've seen the extent of the problem, not just here, but internationally. You've spoken to the victims who've suffered as a result of these lapses. What do you think needs to change? I mean, how do you begin to fix the problem?
I think the difficult answer is there needs to be a proper international public database of banned doctors. I think the only way you solve this problem is through transparency. And I think that the GMC also needs to have a significantly stronger due diligence process when doctors come onto the UK register. Realistically, that's the only way that this issue can be avoided. And this is not just a nice to have, as we've seen in the case of Denise Barnes. Incompetent doctors can kill, and sexually abusing doctors can ruin people's lives. As we've talked to our victims, their lives have been changed fundamentally by the abuse that they've suffered. This is not a nice to have. This is something that needs to be fixed, and yesterday.
That was George Greenwood, investigations reporter at The Times. And you can read the whole investigation online at thetimes.com. The producer today was Shabnam Grewal. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back over the weekend.